Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about political ideologies and we're going to talk about left wing and right wing. And I'm going to try to give you a system that I worked out, that I brought together from a bunch of different places and made some adjustments and changes to that hopefully will be helpful to you and provide a little bit of clarity in this very difficult topic. Online, there's a lot of people who have constant arguments and disagreements that are mostly fruitless and unhelpful about what is left wing and what is right wing. And in any intellectual enterprise, it's mostly about definitions, no less so in this political theory that we're going to do today. And so, if you're going to, what we typically run into is an axis. Okay, so two axes, an x-axis and a y-axis, in which one is economics and the other one is social policy. And it's not really clear what exactly we mean by that, other than there's left economics, left social policy, and right social policy. And so if you're left on both, you're in the upper left quadrant of a 2x2 table or chart, graph. And if you're right on both, you're in the lower right quadrant. So this, gives you an easy way to categorize yourself. But in terms of political ideologies, I don't think it's very helpful. It doesn't have a lot of content, and it requires you to fill in what you think left economics or right economics are, and the same with social policy. So it's not specific enough, and it still leads to all the same disagreements. So I thought and searched for two axes that I thought would be more descriptive and have some more content within them. And the two that I came up with were government involvement in the economy. So this is the degree to which government, or the political part of the society, controls the economy, rather than the social or economic parts of the society controlling it. So this would mean if laws are passed that are going to force the economics to be carried out in a certain way, rather than tradition or allowing the business leaders or the guilds or whatever economic actors are involved in the production part of the economy, rather than allowing them to determine what's going to go on, the political apparatus does that for them. Okay, takes the power away from the people who are doing the work, and determines how that work's going to be done. The other axis is nationalism, and so this is whether the focus and development, whether the spiritual and intellectual and political energies of the country are devoted towards the development of the national body, the national grouping, or something else. So maybe a society really encourages the individual to develop. Well, if that's the case, it's not a nationalist ideology. Maybe a country is totally focused on the development of a world revolution or a supranational political union, whether it's the EU or the United Nations or the League of Nations or something like that. In either of those two cases, if we're promoting the individual, we're not nationalist, and if we're promoting a supranational organization like the UN, then we're not nationalist either. So these are the two axes that I came up with, and you can see the white dots on these axes. We've got 3 positions on the nationalism axis, and we've got 4 positions on the government involvement in the economy axis. So we've, instead of 2x2, we've got 4x3. So we're going to start with the right, and I think that the right is nationalism. So on the nationalist side of this chart, of this graph, we've got 4 positions, starting from most government involvement in the economy at the top down to least. And so we're going to walk through these different ideologies briefly and just talk about how they relate to one another and historically. So National Bolshevism, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on it, but it's the application of Marxist theory to economics and politics while not being internationalist. And so there were people who promoted this stuff historically, and it was a faction in the Soviet Union, but as to how influential it is, I couldn't really say. And there are people who promote this today, and they're not that different from fascists and National Socialists in their policies. But if in my ranking here, I would say that they would be people who would advocate even more state control over the economy than fascism or National Socialism. So moving down one from National Bolshevism to the other two, one thing that um, one thing that the fascist and the National Socialist did not do was chase all of the industrialists and business leaders out of the countries that they took over. So in Italy, there were a lot, and Germany, of course, in the 20s and 30s, there were a lot of pre-existing organizations, combines, corporations that were working beforehand and afterwards. And the government worked closely with them without completely nationalizing them. So that's the reason why I would put fascism and National Socialism down one step on the economic scale. However, both of those top two ideologies are totally nationalist, and they want to develop their own country. They're not really too concerned about the rest of the world, for good or for ill. Authoritarianism is a catch-all term or a residual category that is intended to cover the worldwide military dictatorships that often emerge in response to neoliberalism and the social decay caused by liberalism. And so the careers of these men are often doing import substitution industrialization, which is trying to build up your local strategic industries in your country. And so there is some government involvement in the economy in authoritarian countries, but at the same time, they don't nationalize all these big businesses, they don't throw people out too often, and they also leave a lot of the economy up to other groups. The church, the guilds, all these other people get to participate in the authoritarian economies. They do some interventions, but not as much as the others. And then national anarchism, it's an idea. I can't say that there's enough of these people to fill up one room somewhere, but you could imagine a society, maybe even a pre-modern society, in which people basically want to be left alone. They don't want to be interfered with from the central government, and they pursue traditional economics that they develop at a local level. But at the same time, they have a very strong sense of who they are ethnically, nationally, and racially. So I would put them on the right wing, and I think these are the four right-wing ideologies, in my opinion. In the center, we've still got the gradation from more government involvement to less, but now we're talking about ideologies that are not explicitly nationalist. And so I've got Stalinist communism up there at the top. And what we know is that Stalin and the rest of the Bolsheviks were originally intending on taking over one country and then spreading that ideology worldwide. But after World War II started, especially after the National Socialists in Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin started scaling all that stuff back and working more from a nationalist perspective. And this is probably total pragmatism on his part, but I'm just going to say that mature Stalinist communism is in between nationalism and internationalism. It's got aspects of both, but of course there's still complete state control over every aspect of the economy. So for this purpose, I've got Stalinism in the top, in the middle bracket here in terms of nationalism, but still at the top in terms of state control over the economy. Moving down, we've got social democracy, and this is sort of a residual category that I'm using to describe the modern European welfare state democracy. And the tendency here is kind of like Fabian socialism, we're going to walk step by step by step until the government is controlling basically every aspect of the society. But we're going to do it in a very feminized, not to critique women, but just to use that aspect of things. I'm going to cajole, and I'm going to nudge, and I'm going to wear you down over a long period of time rather than attack you directly. That's what the communists would do, but the social democrats want to move us towards total state control of the economy over a period of 100 years or more. And so there's not really too much of a strong ideology there. It's just what happens in practice in these European countries. And it's certainly not nationalist, but it's not really internationalist either. So it's kind of a mess. It's a mess overall. Now moving down one, I've got a question mark because I'll be right back. Okay, starting at the question mark, I don't really have anything to fit here. I don't know if anything does go there. It may be an empty category. So moving down from that to conservatism, conservatism does not really advocate for government. It advocates for tradition. And so it's kind of more like a time series thing. And this is why some people I've heard really critique the idea that, well, we need to hold to whatever we were doing in the past simply because that's good. And so there's not really a lot of content there. You can't really tell me why it's valuable to do what we were doing without getting into some other thing. So we need a theory of why monarchy's good. We need something to tell us why religion's good, something why the family's good, something why nationalism or internationalism. Just pick your poison. We need to know why that's good, not just because that's what we were doing. And so I think conservatism ends up being pretty much neutered in practice because it can't make these good arguments. Conservatism is like a stand-in for a real ideology. If you are a Christian nationalist, you have a very clear position that you can argue. If you're a conservative making Christian nationalist arguments, you're neutered because you can't go all the way. You can't really take those positions and run with them when you know where you are. So conservatism is a problem in that regard, I think. And so the way that I've got it set up here is less government involvement in the economy, because it doesn't really argue for that. It argues more for the status quo, and the status quo can be different in different places. And then in terms of nationalism, or more or less, it doesn't really argue for either. It just argues for perpetuating whatever system's currently in place. So that's why conservatism ends up here. Now we'll talk about the ideologies of the left. So starting with more government involvement in the economy, and the least nationalist, we have Trotskyism. And so this is the idea of international world revolution. This is the pernicious global destructive force that we have been dealing with for a long time and is still very much alive today. And we're not going to get into that too much because I think you understand what I'm talking about here. So down one from them, we have liberal internationalism and neoliberalism. And so these ideologies basically say, look, we don't want to institute an international world government by crushing everybody. We want to do it through trade, okay? So whereas the Trotskyists are, unapologetically, we're going to put a machine gun on the roof of every building and we're going to whip the population until they do what we want, the liberal internationalists are saying, look, we're going to go to all these foreign countries, we're going to cajole their leaders, we're probably going to film them engaging in underground pedophile activities, and then we're going to blackmail them. And then the neoliberal groups say we're just going to buy them all off. Okay? So these guys in this category, they do believe in lots and lots and lots of government involvement in the economy, nationally and internationally. And they form these big trading blocks in order to limit commerce and put sanctions on people. So the Trotskyists are basically, they're covered in gore. They are spattered in blood and gore, and they don't care, and they're willing to present themselves like that. And so the neoconservatives in America, hey, that's who we're dealing with. We're dealing with the Trotskyites who want to go bomb Syria, North Korea, whoever, anyone who sticks their head up, they want to bomb them. The liberal internationalists, this would be more like your Obama and Hillary Clinton types. They want to bomb people too, but they want to do it on a reduced scale, and they want to pursue a lot of international organizations. And so domestically, they both agree on a lot, and that's part of our problem in American politics. Now, and of course, they're both completely a nationalist. The Trotskyites don't care about any of the nations that they occupy, except for one in the Middle East. And the liberal internationalists don't even care about that. They don't even care about that one country in the Middle East, right? Much less the countries that they represent at a national level. Moving down again is market liberalism or libertarianism. So this is the dominant ideology that comes out of the French Revolution, the dominant ideology of the American founders. These are people who believe in personal, individual freedom. So they're not nationalists in any way, shape, or form, right? You cannot both advocate for your nation and for the rights of all individuals at the same time. These things are in contradiction. And that's a bitter pill for many of us to swallow, including myself, who, the first time I really got in politics, it was because, as one of my friends told me, you feel the boot on your neck. You feel the boot on your neck, and then that leads you to say, well, I want my freedom. I want the freedom of the American tradition. And so that leads you into libertarianism, and hopefully through enough reflection and study, you understand that this idea of personal individual freedom and liberty is Illuminist, Freemasonic, and comes out of the French Revolution, right? And that these ideas about freedom and personal liberation and personal development are they're Luciferian, and they're intended to destroy national culture, to destroy the family, to destroy everything that made Europe great. I would say I would go so far as to say that. And then we'll go down one more to the last category of scum anarchism. And these are the anti-fascist mobs, I would say. These are the people who hate all nations, hate all ethnic groups and races, they hate all authority in general. So I think they probably have a pretty deep personal problem, psychological problem. They maybe don't like who they are, and therefore they want to destroy all these things in the world that have created the world that they occupy and that they feel uncomfortable in. So it's not so much a political ideology as it is a psychological tendency, but it does occupy this grouping in which these people don't want to see any kind of authority, and then they also hate all the distinctions that come up between people. So these are the political groupings here. And to just try to describe further how I think these interact with each other, we'll walk through a little bit of how it functions in practice, just to make sure it's clear. So the Washington Consensus is, I think, these groupings here. It's Trotskyism, so this is the neocons. It's the liberal internationals and neoliberals. These are the Bill Clintons, the George Bushes, all these type of people. George H.W. Bush, Poppy Bush, and social democracy, of course, because, hey, Fabian socialism and giving everybody a vote's great. Another thing I'd like to point out with these guys, well, should we talk about that? These are all political ideologies, okay? So anybody can be talking as though they believe in this stuff and argue for it. But they can also truly be any of these other ideologies. So I could present to you as though I'm a social democrat, and I could actually be a Trotskyite, okay? And this is a huge problem. This is an enormous problem. I could be let's say, I could be an authoritarian and be presenting as a conservative, and I think that is Also extremely common, because people who, like Father Charles Coughlin, for instance, he would have been one of those type of people who's got very strong authoritarian religious tendencies, but has to present as a conservative just because that's the only thing that'll work in America. And speaking of which, this hashed line around conservatism is because in the Washington Consensus, there are a lot of people who present as conservatives, and they're actually just social democrats or neoliberals or libertarians. There are hardly any, real conservatives in Washington, D.C. in any position of power. And the real issue is that even if there were, I'm not sure what they could actually accomplish. So the solid line groupings are the ones that are accepted in the Washington Consensus, and everybody who's outside of it is either never going to get into a position of power or just a useful idiot who's employed every now and then for other purposes. So now, by comparison, the National Socialist regime in Germany was made up of the authoritarians, who were these Prussian military aristocratic types, the fascist National Socialist type people, who were members of the middle class for the most part, people like Hitler and Goebbels, middle class type people. And then the big grouping of National Bolsheviks, essentially, within the National Socialist Party. And these would have been represented by Otto Wagner, Rome, all those SA guys who got bumped off in the Operation Colibri. So that grouping, the National Bolshevist grouping in the Hitler regime, essentially got wiped out, and it was then a battle between the National Socialists and the authoritarians. And of course, the authoritarians tried to kill Hitler. So just because, there's not in any country, any one of these ideologies, there's not enough people to really run the country or run the economy or really do anything. So every single regime, I would say, in the world has different factions. Different factions that make it up, and this is just the natural tendency. Finally, or again, we'll talk about Franco's regime just to compare that to the Hitler regime. Franco's regime was made up of the fascists, the authoritarians, and a bunch of conservatives too, actually. And in that case, the fascists weren't the dominant grouping; it was the authoritarians, and that's just by comparison. And let me take care of my son again, and then we'll talk about the Bolsheviks in Russia. And so in Russia, after the October coup, the group who would be the Reds, the ones who were opposing the Whites, were quite diverse, quite a large grouping, and that doesn't even take into account the national groupings and the anarchists. So there were the actual Bolsheviks themselves, there were social democrats, and there were even people who would later articulate clearly that they were fascists. And what happened over time is that those groups became disenchanted with the way that the Civil War was playing out and the actions that the central government was taking, and then they no longer supported it, and then in consequence they were eliminated. And so this trend continued onward. In the 20s and 30s, there was the big struggle between Stalin and Trotsky, and all the Trotskyists were purged. So the Social Democrats were purged during the Civil War itself. The fascists were purged later. The Trotskyites were purged in the 30s. And so we ended up, I think, in the Soviet Union with just two groups, the Stalinists and the National Bolsheviks. And I think that kind of carried through with the later history of the Soviet Union in the 20th century as it became more and more nationalist and more Russian, even though the ideology itself was still, the ruling members were still a bunch of these guys who had come up under the original Bolshevist propaganda. So it's a very difficult subject matter, and people have a lot of very different opinions about exactly what was going on there. But at least trying to explain this stuff that I'm trying to work out here with these political ideologies, this is how I would describe it. You started out with a bigger grouping that included a bunch of these different groups. 5 I've got listed here, and the ones on the margins were eliminated, and then you ended up with these two final groups. So what else have we got to say? out of all of this, who is against the New World Order? And this is a difficult question, but it's an important one. It's difficult because where you're coming from, okay? If you're a conservative and I'm a fascist, or vice versa, we disagree fundamentally about the future that we want to see. But we're both disenfranchised, okay? If you're a national Bolshevik and a national anarchist are both totally disenfranchised. There's no way that either of them are going to have any access to power, and they're not going to be able to do anything in this political system in basically any Western country. So even where they completely disagree, they are united. We are united, regardless of what our viewpoint is, in opposition to this evil and deleterious world order. I've got the four groups on the right there outlined from the National Bolsheviks, the Fascists or National Socialists, the Authoritarians, and the National Anarchists. And then I've got a hash mark going around conservatives, because the conservatives, God bless them, they don't know who they are, they don't know what they're doing, and they don't know what they want. And they serve as a foil for the New World Order. And I tried to explain this in the video that I made about the British elections, is that conservatism is basically a corral or a holding pen for the cattle. And I guess I would just think of conservatives, or conservatives are people who haven't really figured out that there are other positions that almost assuredly represent them better than this so-called ideology of conservatism. Most of these people are actually authoritarians. Okay, let's be honest. That's actually what most conservatives are, truth be told. When they learn more things, they might end up in a different group, but that's really who they are and what they want. I think I've said all I have to say here, and I would be interested in getting feedback from you on what you think about this typology of political ideologies, what you think about the value of this kind of analysis, and if you think I'm way off base with any of this. I know that it's not airtight. I know that there are some problems with this, and there's some stuff we have to gloss over to make it work. But this is my sincere attempt to try to fill in these problems that we've got with this idea of what's left and what's right, and just point out that, however you set your definitions, that's what you're going to get out of it. And if you and your interlocutor, the person that you're discussing with or talking to or arguing with, if you both come from different definitions, you're not going to get anywhere, and you're going to talk past each other. This is the big issue of why multiculturalism is a pipe dream and a failure. Because if you and I are coming from different places, we can't communicate. You have to have a shared language, you have to have a shared history of ideas and a shared culture in order to pass these ideas back and forth and hopefully produce something that's going to work better for us. Okay, thank you for your time. Talk to you again soon, I hope.